In this chapter, we're going to learn how to actually render some live data. At the moment, all we're doing in our dashboard component is actually referencing a static array. However, in your applications, this isn't the way that you're going to be doing things. So you may have looked by now, and we have this db.json file here, which in the next few videos, we're going to put our passenger array, and this actually acts as a local JSON server. So it basically gives us a live API to work against. So the first thing that we need to do is create our service. Now, we talked about services in the architectural overview at the beginning of this course. So we're going to go ahead and create our own service. Now, what we're going to do is put it next to the dashboard module. So what we can do is simply create a new file here. So what we're going to do is passenger and then dashboard.service.ts. So inside of here, all we're going to do is export and a class, and we're going to call this the passenger dashboard service. So you may realize by now that everything in Angular is a class. Now we're going to create a constructor as well. So underneath here, what we're going to do is create a function called getPassengers. Now this is where we're going to create our first static piece of data. And then in the next few videos, we're going to hook it up to our live server. So the first thing that we need to do is actually save this out quickly. We'll copy this name and we'll head across to our dashboard module. Now we need to register this module inside our service. So we can just leave a comment here. And what we're going to do is import our dashboard service and then from, and because it's in the root directory, we can do // and then you can see that TypeScript has then found that reference to our passenger service. Now, this is a new piece of information that we need to know about an ng module. At the moment, we've been dealing with components, and we've also been dealing with importing other modules, and we've also exported a dashboard component. Now, in Angular, a service is something that we call a provider. So if you go onto your ng module and start typing providers, you can see that this pops up. And again, this is just going to be an array. So we're going to paste this value in again, and we have our passenger dashboard service that we've imported from the file that we've just created. So this essentially tells our ng module that we have these components, and one of these components may rely on this service. So what we're going to do is basically make this service available to any of the components. And this is done through something called dependency injection. So now you've done this, what you can do is close off the module. Now what we're going to do for this video is something rather simple. We're just going to import the data and return it from this getPassenger call. So if you go into your container component, we can open up this. You can scroll down into your component class and you can grab the this.passengers array. So I'm just going to highlight everything here and we'll go down to the bottom. Now I'm going to copy this and simply delete it. Now don't save this at the moment, because it will then throw an error. So we'll go back in here and what we'll do is just write a return statement. So we're going to return this array after we've just pasted it in. So you can see that we're creating now a data layer for our application. So we have this passenger dashboard service and it's going to have a method on it called getPassengers. When we call that method, it's going to return all of our passengers. So you can see all of our passengers live inside of here. So we can save this file. Now what we want to do is go back into our component. This is where things get interesting. So what we're going to look at is something called dependency injection. Now you may have looked at something called dependency injection and used a constructor function in perhaps ES6 beforehand. And you may have done something like foo. And then inside of the constructor, you might have done this.foo equals foo. So you essentially take this reference and then bind it to a local foo property. Now in TypeScript, we can do a similar thing. However, we can automate it. So what we want to do is use a word called private. So this will essentially allow us to inject the dependency into here and tell TypeScript that it's a private method. So we shouldn't be calling it publicly. And we're going to give this an alias of passenger and then capital S service. Now the interesting piece is how Angular looks up tokens. So we need to tell Angular what this passenger service is going to be. Now we've exported a member called the dashboard passenger service. So what we actually need to do is import it into this component and then register it in the actual constructor. So what we'll do is import the passenger dashboard service, and we actually have to go back a few levels when we import this. So we'll do .. // and then TypeScript will then give us a couple of options and we can choose the service. So you can have .. / passenger dashboard service. So TypeScript has now found this. So now we have a reference to our service in this particular component. We can scroll down to our constructor, and this is the interesting part, is we can just paste it in here. Now what Angular will do is use this token to essentially bind it automatically for you to an internal property called passenger service. Now this might sound complicated, but essentially all it's doing is this .passenger service equals the passenger dashboard service. So this is kind of doing a local wiring up for you. So when we go back to our ng on init, we can actually replace all of that data that we used at the beginning with this static array. So what we can do is this .passenger service, and then we can just call get passengers. So this will actually return us an array of our passengers. One thing that's also going to be handy here is importing our TypeScript model for our interface. So let's go back to our dashboard service, and we're going to tell TypeScript that this function is going to return a passenger array. Now we don't actually have this locally, so we'll go up here and import this. So we'll do import and we'll paste the passenger in, and we'll do from, and then .models / passenger interface. So now we're using TypeScript properly. We're importing our passenger interface. We've created a get method. We're simply saying it returns an array of passengers. And obviously, if I change one of these to a string, it's going to go red. So TypeScript again is helping here to make sure that our data sets are correct. Now, before we go back to the browser, you need to make sure that you have saved this out. Now, this is what we call a synchronous call. So this is synchronously being bound to this .passengers. So this video is purely demonstrating how to create a service. So let's go to the browser and check this out. So in the browser, you should see the exact same things that we had before. We can remove an item, we can edit an item, press save, and we're all done. So our data is now completely out of the component, and we've created our first data service. We've also injected a service like we talked about right at the beginning of this course in the architectural video, where we bind a particular service to a component. So this video has actually demonstrated that we've done that. In the next few videos, we're actually going to hook up to our live API and start using the Angular HTTP module. In the last video, we created our very first service. Now, what we want to do is obviously learn about how to create an HTTP request. So the first thing we'll do is jump into our passenger dashboard module. Now this is where we're importing things like ng module and the common module, but now we also need to import something called the HTTP module. So we'll go ahead and do that, and we'll do from @Angular, and this will come from Angular /HTTP. So once you've done that, go ahead and copy this, and we'll scroll down to our ng module, and all we need to do is add a comma. So we're saying that our ng module is then importing this HTTP module because we want to use it in our service. So this will then import the dependencies needed for Angular's HTTP requests. So we can close this off for now. Now, the purpose of this video is to actually show you something called injectable, which if you've browsed the Angular docs, you may have seen already. So we've already learned about using the word private, and you can also use the word public if you want a public method. Now, if I just quickly flick back to here, you can see that we dependency injected our service to our constructor. So this is how we can essentially inject the HTTP service that we just imported from the HTTP module into our dashboard service. So what we can do is just do private and then HTTP, and we're going to say it's going to be an HTTP token. Now to import this, we can go up here. We'll do import HTTP from @angular/http. So now these are all hooked up correctly. What we can do is actually, in fact, go console log, and then we'll do this.http. So what we'll expect in the browser is to actually see this HTTP object. However, what we're going to see is something different. So you can see a white screen. So let's open up the DevTools and see what went wrong. We have an error here saying syntax error, can't resolve all the parameters for the dashboard service. So what has actually gone wrong here? So let's go back and fix this. In the first video, I wanted to demo how you can use a service without any dependencies. So you might actually not have a dependency in some services. However, when we do rely on a particular provider, such as the HTTP here, we need to import this thing called injectable. So we'll do import injectable, and this one just comes from @angular/core. So this actually comes from Angular core. We'll take the injectable, and again, just like component, we do @injectable, and we simply mark this passenger dashboard service as its injectable. So this will tell Angular that we can inject things into its constructor. So this allows us to use dependency injection inside our other classes. So before we go back to the browser, what we'll do is quickly console log, and then we'll do this.http, so we can actually see that this is working. So you can see our application is now working, and we have this HTTP object. So we've got backend. Now these things are private methods because they're underscored. However, all the object properties that we want, such as delete, get, head, options, patch, post, etc., things for making XHR requests, are available on the prototype. What we'll do is quickly remove the console log and save this out. So now you've understood the reason for this @injectable. We remove it and we use a dependency. Our application will break. If we don't need a dependency, the application will work fine. However, it might be a good practice and a good consistency, even if you're not using something in the constructor as a dependency, just to mark things as injectable. So now you understand the reason between the two. We're going to go ahead and actually hook up our data to Angular's HTTP service. In the previous video, we covered the @injectable syntax and why we need to use it, because we are using an external dependency called HTTP, which we have imported from Angular. Now in this video, we're going to learn how to use the HTTP module with observables. So what I want you to do is essentially grab all of this data and just simply copy it. And what we'll do is delete what we've got. Now, if you hop over into the db.json, which you can see down here, so yours will be an empty object at the moment. What I've actually done is gone and converted all my data to JSON. Now you can see here, the most important thing is I have an object property called passengers. So create an object with a key of passengers, and then paste your array in and then convert it over to JSON. Now we're not going to do these because it will take a while for this video. So I'm going to assume that you've done that. So you have a final product that looks like this with everything as valid JSON. So once you've done that, you can simply save it out and exit. So now we've injected a token of HTTP. It's now available as this.http. So we can do this.http and we can just do get. Now our passenger API is actually set up to a API/passengers. So what we're going to do is create a constant here. So we'll do passenger underscore API and then equals /API. So I'm actually using the local server here, and then /passengers. So create this constant and then we can reference it below. I'm going to add the type of string as well. So what we're going to do is pass this passenger API into our GET request. So you can see here it says type observable response is not assignable to type passenger array. So because we're returning this.http, that is in fact an observable, not our passenger array. So what we really want is to return an observable with type passenger. What we need to do is import this observable object from up here. So we can just do simply import observable and then from rxjs/observable. And we'll actually have another error now that we fixed this one, which we'll explain momentarily. So we've imported observable and we've now assigned the correct type of what we're returning from this function. Now I'm going to bump this onto a new line. Now what we're going to do is something called map. Now you've used this in JavaScript, so we do .map. Now what we actually get in this map call is the response object. So if I quickly delete this a second, you can actually see type response is not assignable to type passenger array. So when I uncomment this, we're actually going to get the response object because that is the next method that's called via Angular. So we can do our arrow function inside of here. And all we want to do at this point is return the response, and we can use this .json. Then we call this JSON method to actually extract the data as a JSON object. So you can see that this type cannot find name response. All this is a simple type check in Angular. So all we need to do to fix this technically is add the word response. Now at the minute we have one problem. We have property map does not exist on type observable. Now map is just like a JavaScript function. You can see that you can map over something or a collection. So all we need to do, because the HTTP is in fact an observable and we've imported the observable operator, we've said that we're returning an observable, we just need to import this map operator. So we'll do import and then rxjs /add and then /operator and then /map. So that's all we need to do to import and add properties to observable things such as this.http. Now you can see here that the red underline has disappeared because map has now been added to the HTTP observable object. So this is some nice magic that's happening here. And if I go back and I can uncomment this, our error comes back and we'll just go up and fix this. Now to finish this off, we will just use a shorthand arrow function and go and wire this up correctly in our component. So you can see how this is nice and clean, and observables don't need to be complicated. If you want to use them, you can simply import something such as map and then bind it to something in Angular, because Angular uses the reactive paradigm. So things like get, we actually need to return an observable and then subscribe to them. So if we open up our dashboard component, you can see we have this red underline. So let's take a look. It says type observable passenger is not assignable to type array of passengers. So what we're actually doing here is trying to assign an observable response to this.passengers. So this is actually incorrect. So what we'll do is delete this and delete this. So what we're going to basically do on init, which as we discussed in a previous video, on init is where you should do initialization logic. We're actually going to use this property called subscribe. So inside our subscribe, what we're going to get back is the data, and it's going to be a passenger array. So it's going to be an array of passengers. Inside our arrow function, we can then do this.passengers equals that data object. Now earlier on, we had our huge JSON object with all of our passengers inside that looks something like this. All we're doing is taking that data from our local database, asking for it via Angular's HTTP. We're converting the response from JSON. We're saying here that the type that we're returning will be an observable. Inside of here, we're simply using ng on init. So we're not using the constructor because you shouldn't use that for things like data requests. We want to initialize these when the component is in fact ready. And then we've called this.passenger service, which we've injected. We've called get passengers, we've then subscribed, we've passed our data, which we need to then finally assign in this.passengers. So let's go back, and what we'll actually do is add a console login here, and we'll just say data, and then we'll just pass the data in. So we can actually see that this is coming from our new HTTP module. One thing you might need to do is restart the server, because anything we add in this db.json won't be locally recognized. So if you're using the integrated terminal, you can simply open it up and use Control-C to actually stop the process. Then we can just run a yarn start. So this will then go ahead and pick up on these live JSON changes. So now that we've done this, we've logged everything out. We can go back to the browser and check out our new database, which is being driven from an actual HTTP request. So when we go back to the browser, you can see that all of our items have been loaded. I can refresh and you can see that there's a slight delay coming back through these. Now there's actually an error going on in the console. So this is why we taught you the safe navigation operator, because when we make asynchronous requests, things that we reference in our templates might not be available. So this one is actually telling us that the passenger count component cannot read the property length of undefined. But you can in fact see our data array objects here. So these are actually coming back and being logged inside our application. What we'll do first is quickly neaten this up. So we're going to use an array function because we've had a look at our data coming back. So now that we are using the shorthand array function, you can see that everything is being done in 3 lines of code. So this is really clean. Our component has a service injected. We're making that call. We're subscribing to the call, and then we're just binding the result of that call. Now the problem was in fact inside this handle count component. Now this is because we are just passing this.passengers, which is bound inside of here, directly into here as an input. So when we open this up, we have input items, and then we have items.length. So what we need to do is add the safe navigation. We can save that out. We can close the file. So what Angular will do at this point is essentially wait for that property to be available. Once it becomes available, the change detection will fire, the input will get rebound, and the properties will display in the browser. So what we're going to do is head inside the service. Now we have a function that does get passengers. All we're going to do is copy this, and we're going to change the name to update passenger. So we can remove the S on here. We're going to get a passenger object passed in to us. So we can again say that's of type passenger. We can then change the get to a put because we want to make a put request. So alongside our passenger API, we can do plus, and then because we're going to talk to an individual passenger, we can add that passenger's ID. So what we're going to do is passenger.id. Now we can do it this way. However, what we're going to do is convert it over to using ES6 strings. So what we're going to do is $, and then this object, and then another object here. And what we're going to use is a backtick at the front. And we'll simply wrap this in an object as well. We'll put a backtick at the beginning and a $sign. So in fact, this is the equivalent of what we've just done, but it essentially allows us to compose strings with JavaScript properties inside if you haven't used this already. So the final thing here is we are not actually returning an array of passengers. We are just returning one passenger. So when we update a passenger, we're actually going to send that passenger back because we are just talking to a single passenger. So because we're using .put, we actually need to pass the passenger that we're making the request to so it knows which one to talk to. So it's going to make a request to something like /2 or /1, depending which one we talk to. And then we pass that passenger that we get back through here. So we'll copy the update service. We'll save this out. Go into our dashboard component. Now we've already got the logic for this set up. So this is actually going to be quite simple. So all we need to do is reference this .passenger service, and we're going to call update passenger. All we're going to do is pass in the event. So you can see here that the event is of type passenger. We're going to update that particular passenger. Now, again, because it's an observable, we need to subscribe to it. We're going to get the data back. It's going to be of type passenger. We're going to use our array function. Now inside of here is what we actually want to use this logic. So if the request was successful, we can then update our API. So that's all you need to do. You need to simply just wrap it in a service call. So in the browser, you can see our airline passenger list as usual. Now, when we click edit, we can go ahead and rename to Motto. We can click done. You can see that this has now been locally saved. However, if we refresh the page, you can see that this is being persisted. So let's actually open up the DevTools and see what's happening. So if we change this back to Stephen and click done, you can see it's made that put request to passengers/1. It's updated Stephen. So this change will actually be locally saved to your db.json file. So any changes that you make inside of these, you will actually see them updated if you open the file. So you can see I can change it back, I can refresh the page, it's going to make the request again to pull in all of the passengers, and all of the data is being persisted. So let's go back and add the ability to remove our passengers. All we need to do is simply go ahead and we'll copy this function again and paste it below. Now what we're going to do is in fact call it remove passenger. It's going to take a passenger as an object. It's going to take a passenger through the arguments of type passenger. It's also going to return an observable. However, this time we're going to use the delete. So this time we do not need to pass the individual passenger. We can just simply reference the full URL of the passenger that we want to delete. Now, if we check the db.json, you can actually see that this has persisted my name change. So any changes inside of here that you make, you will need to restart your server. However, any changes in the browser, this will actually read and write from. So we don't really want to touch that if you can help it. So now we've created this remove passenger. We've learned about how to use HTTP GET. We've learned put. We've learned delete. I'm sure you can work out how to use post. So what we're going to do is use the remove passenger inside our dashboard component. So inside of here, we've done the handle edit and we've done this passenger service, update the passenger. So inside of here, as you probably guessed by now, we're going to this dot passenger service and we are going to call remove passenger. So you can see we're getting the event through. We also need to subscribe. We're going to get our data back. It's going to be of type passenger. And inside of here, what we can do is simply move the logic below up into the function. So I'm going to copy this and we'll just paste this in and format this nicely. So what will happen here is the handle remove function will get called, and as before, it will remove it from our array. However, before that, it's going to communicate with our passenger service. So it's going to make the delete request via the remove passenger. It passes the passenger in. We then subscribe to the event, which gives us the passenger. And then inside of there, because we're using an arrow function, we have access to this.passengers. So let's go and try this out. And bear in mind that any changes that we make will actually update this db.json. So what I'm going to do is actually delete James. However, I'm going to copy his local object so I can add it back after we've deleted it. So we'll go ahead, save this out and go back to the browser and delete James. So as usual, we can scroll down. As promised, we said that we would remove James. So we've clicked remove. He's gone from our first list. He's also gone from our second list. When we press refresh, you can see that he is no longer there. So the way that we can confirm this is by checking our db.json file. So let's go back and have a look. So we'll go back into db.json and you can see that James has been obliterated. We have ID of 1, 2, and 4. So what I'm going to do is paste James back in just so we have him available again. So in this video, you have learned how to use the HTTP module. We've imported HTTP. We've then injected it into here. We've created a few functions called get passengers, update passengers, remove passenger. We've then used this.http, we've used the get method, we've used the put method, we've used the delete method. We've learned how to use an observable and subscribe to it inside our dashboard component. So inside of here, you can see that our initial data request is being made. So this is typically where you'll want to make your first data requests. Inside of here, we're then using our handle edit to talk to our service that we've set up. We're then subscribing to it. Inside the handle remove, we're calling the handle remove. and then we're just implementing that logic like we have done in loads of the previous videos. So at this point, you should be very familiar and you should be very confident in using the HTTP module with Angular. In the previous video, we covered how to use HTTP. Now in this video, it's going to be a very short one. However, we're going to show you how to create new headers or request options. Now it might be that you're communicating with a JSON server. However, sometimes you may not use the same application type. So for instance, in our update passenger service, this is actually defaulting to using application JSON. So what we're going to do in this video is quickly import something called headers and request options and show you how to create them because you may need them when you're actually building your Angular apps. So we'll go up to the top, and from the HTTP module, what we're going to do is import something called headers, and we're also going to import request options. And you can see all the TypeScript drop downs are extremely helpful again. So we don't actually need to do this for our application. However, I'm just going to show you how to do it. So we're going to do let headers equals new headers. And this is simply going to be an object. So inside this object, we can create a property called content type. Now, if you've been dealing with content types and headers, you'll know exactly what these mean. And all we need to do is say it's going to be of type application/JSON. So this is actually creating a header that we'll send with our HTTP request that's going to tell the request to be of application JSON type. The next thing, we're going to create let options, and we'll do equals new request options. Now, again, this is just going to be an object. Inside of here, we can create a property called headers, and we can just say headers. Now, this is actually referencing this object here. So alternatively, you could copy this object and do something like this and just indent it if you wanted to. But essentially, this is where you can create different types of request options and set the headers of that particular request. To actually add them to the response, all we need to do is pass in our options. So our options here corresponds to let options. So this property here gets passed in here. So that's how you can create custom headers and content types, and also create custom configurations when making your HTTP requests. So now we've learned Angular's HTTP module, we're going to look at a quick promises alternative. If you don't want to use RxJS or subscriptions or anything like this, you can get away with just using promises. So what we'll do is go into our passenger dashboard service. Now, what we actually need to do if we want to convert these to promises, instead of importing map, we can import to promise. So this will allow us to essentially change this to a promise. So what we can then do is call to promise. Now you can see that map has then gone underlined red, so we can call them. Now this is erroring because it's saying we are returning an observable. So we can just simply change this to a promise and the type has been corrected. So that's our first one that's been changed to a promise. So we'll copy this and we'll go down and we'll add it to the end of this one. We'll add this to then. We'll then change this one to promise. So this tells the update passengers to in fact return a promise. Then we'll do the same with remove passenger. So we'll do dot to promise. We'll change the callback to a then. We'll change the return type to a promise of passenger. And that's all we need to do. We are in fact importing an RxJS operator to do this. And I strongly advise that you do learn RxJS and do use RxJS. But in the meantime, if you want to get comfortable with Angular before, you can use this to promise syntax. So this won't actually work directly just yet because inside our dashboard component, we're actually using subscribe. Now, this might be a quick wake up moment for you because we can highlight all of these and change them to dot then, and you can see that everything is working correctly. So at this point, there's not a huge difference between RxJS subscriptions and using a promise callback. So we'll go back to the browser and just confirm that everything is working as intended. So you can see here that we have total checked in 2 out of 4 because we removed Steve, and we can carry on and start editing. So we can actually add Steve back and give that a refresh. So that's how to use Angular's promise implementation if you want to convert your RxJS observable to a promise. In this video, we're going to learn how to use observables with error handling. So if you go ahead and open up the passenger dashboard, what we're going to do is duplicate these, and we're going to import the catch operator, and we're also going to import throw. Now, one change we need to make is change this to observable because it's actually part of the observable and it's not an operator itself. So what we want to do is scroll down to our responses, and what we can simply do is just chain these like we have done with map. So what we can do is .catch. Now what we'll get through here is in fact an error. Now depending on what your error response will be, you can set a custom type. However, we're just going to use any. Now inside this arrow function, what we're going to simply do is do observable and then .throw. And because we're getting this error here, what we'll do is error.json. So we'll actually abstract the JSON from the error response. Now this is actually very simple. We can copy this and we can just go down to each of these. We can delete the semicolons, add them to each and every one of these. Now, what this means when we save this is that if there is an error in one of our responses, inside our dashboard component, the subscription actually has two arguments. So the first argument is our response. However, we can have a second argument, which will be the error. Now you can see here that this is automatically popped up here saying error. So this allows us to essentially use an observable to throw the error, so we can do some error handling inside the second argument should we need to. So now you've learned how to add an observable, catch and throw to your Angular HTTP requests to then continue the observable sequence.